Not all marriages are born of love. Some spring from necessity, others from convenience, and a few emerge from the purest despair that a man can know. Thomas Whitman watched the last goats of his herd graze on the parched land that was once green and prosperous. The relentless sun of the Arizona Territory had turned his farm into a reminder of what it used to be. The wobbly fences trembled in the hot wind, and the main well dried up 3 months ago. At 42, Thomas knew well the bitter taste of defeat, but he never imagined that he would go so far as to consider trading his freedom for a single dairy goat. The woman arrived in a dusty wagon pulled by a horse as thin as herself. He didn't say his name right away, just pointing to the fence where hung a faded sign that Thomas had nailed weeks ago when the situation wasn't yet completely desperate. The poster offered marriage in exchange for cattle, a proposal that he wrote on a night of drinking and despair, but that he never had the courage to take away. She was small and angular, with dark brown hair tied up in a tight bun. His skin was sunburned in a way that revealed years of hard work in the great outdoors. The eyes, small and dark, seemed to hold secrets that Thomas could not decipher. She wasn't pretty by the standards that society set, but there was something about her that intrigued him. Maybe it was the way he kept his shoulders straight despite his evident poverty, or how his eyes never averted when he spoke. The goat she brought as a dowry was pregnant and healthy. Thomas quickly calculated that the animal was worth more than anything he still owned. The woman said little during the negotiation, only agreed to the basic terms and said her name was Sarah. He did not mention where he came from, nor why a woman would travel alone through the territory looking for an unknown husband. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small chapel of the city. Reverend Morrison seemed uncomfortable throughout the ceremony, casting questioning glances at Thomas, as if trying to understand why a decent man would accept such an arrangement. Sarah wore a simple, faded blue cotton dress, the only one she seemed to own. He did not smile during the ceremony, but he did not show nervousness either. His expression remained serene, almost distant, as if he were watching other people's weddings. After the ceremony, they returned to the farm in silence. Sarah surveyed the property with critical eyes, noting the poor condition of the facility, the parched land, the few animals that remained. Thomas expected some comment, perhaps an expression of regret, but she only nodded approvingly and began to unload her few possessions from the wagon. Over the simple dinner she prepared with the few ingredients available, Thomas tried to strike up a conversation. He asked about his family, his hometown, his plans for the farm. Sarah responded with monosyllables or simple nods. She wasn't rude, but she clearly wasn't interested in sharing details of her previous life. The only thing he said was that he understood agriculture and animal husbandry, and that he intended to help the farm prosper again. The night arrived with the weight of all the unspoken expectations between them. Thomas had prepared the master bedroom, changing the sheets and organizing the space as best he could. When she showed Sarah the room, she examined everything with the same neutral expression as always, just said it was adequate, and asked for a few minutes to get ready. Thomas waited in the room, nervous as a boy for the first time. He didn't know what to expect from a woman who had agreed to marry a stranger for the sake of sheer convenience. When he finally went to the room, he found the door ajar and Sarah already lying down, covered up to her neck. She watched him with those inscrutable dark eyes, and for the first time since he had met her, Thomas thought he saw a glimmer of something he couldn't identify. Fear, perhaps, or expectation. He approached slowly, respecting her space, when a strange sound echoed outside. It was like a howl, but unlike anything he had ever heard. Sarah stiffened on the bed, her breathing quicker, and her eyes turned to the window with an expression Thomas couldn't interpret. The sound repeated, closer this time, and Sarah mumbled something so low he couldn't understand. The wind shook the curtains, bringing with it the scent of desert night and something else, something wild and primal that made the hairs on Thomas's arm stand on end. Sarah remained motionless, but he could feel the tension emanating from her, like the warmth of a campfire. The howl echoed a third time, longer and melancholy, and this time Thomas was sure it was not from any animal he knew. Sarah abruptly rose from the bed, still dressed in her simple cotton nightgown. Her movements were swift and decisive, as if responding to a call that only she could hear. Thomas tried to speak, to ask what was going on, but she raised a hand asking for silence. His eyes shone strangely in the dim light of the room, reflecting the moonlight in a way that didn't look completely human. Sarah walked to the window with silent steps, as if her feet knew every floorboard she could creak. Thomas watched their movements with a mixture of fascination and growing concern. She rested her hands on the windowsill and tilted her head, as if she were hearing something he couldn't perceive. The moonlight bathed his face, revealing an expression he had never seen before. She was no longer the reserved, practical woman she had met 3 days ago. It was something different, something that made him question whether he really knew the person he had married. The howl echoed again, closer now, coming from the direction of the small forest that marked the western limits of the property. Sarah responded with a low, guttural sound that made Thomas's blood run cold in her veins. They were not words, but some kind of primitive communication that he could not understand. She turned to him, and her eyes reflected the moonlight in a way that wasn't natural. For a moment, Thomas had the impression that he was looking at a wild animal trapped in a human form. She made her way to the dresser where she had kept her few clothes and began to dress quickly. Thomas tried to ask what was going on, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. There was something in the atmosphere of the room that prevented him from speaking, as if the air itself had become dense and charged with an energy he could not name. Sarah wore a dark dress he hadn't seen before, made of a fabric that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. When she finished getting dressed, Sarah approached Thomas. For the first time since he met her, she touched his face gently. Her hands were warm, almost feverish, and there was an intensity in her eyes that made him feel as if she was trying to etch her image into his memory. She mumbled something in a language he didn't recognize, words that sounded ancient and powerful. Then, without any explanation, he headed for the door. Thomas followed her to the front porch, where she stopped and looked toward the woods. The moon was full and bright, turning the landscape into a canvas of silver and deep shadows. The wind had stopped completely, creating a silence that seemed otherworldly. Sarah took a deep breath, as if she was inhaling something more than just night air. His shoulders relaxed for the first time since Thomas met her, and he realized she was coming home. Not for his farm, but for something much older and more fundamental. She began to walk towards the forest with determined steps. Thomas called to her, his voice finally returning, but she didn't turn around. He ran after her, trying to catch up with her, but found that he couldn't move as fast as he should. It was as if the very air was resisting his movements, as if some invisible force was holding him back. Sarah walked with a flowing grace he had never noticed before, her feet barely touching the dusty ground. When they reached the edge of the forest, Sarah finally stopped. She turned to Thomas one last time, and he saw tears glistening in her dark eyes. They were not tears of sadness, but something more complex. Gratitude, perhaps, or a form of apology for something she couldn't explain. She reached out and touched his chest, right over his heart, and Thomas felt a wave of warmth spread through his body. At that moment, he understood that she was not leaving by choice, but by necessity. Sarah turned and disappeared among the trees with a speed that defied logic. Thomas tried to follow her, but the shadows of the forest seemed to move and rearrange, creating paths that led to nowhere. He shouted his name until his voice was hoarse, but only the echo of his own hopelessness returned. The forest had swallowed his wife as if she had never existed, leaving only the wild scent he had smelled in the room and a sense of loss that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. When the sun rose, Thomas was still standing at the edge of the forest, waiting for something he couldn't define. Daylight revealed only ordinary trees and thorny shrubs. There were no footprints on the soft earth, no sign that anyone had passed by during the night. It was as if Sarah had dissolved into thin air, leaving only the memories of 3 days of marriage that now seemed to belong to a strange and intense dream. Thomas returned to the empty house, where Sarah's belongings were still stored on the dresser. His simple clothes, an old hairbrush, a small hand mirror, all very ordinary and human, tangible evidence that she had existed, that she had not imagined the whole experience. But there was something else, something he hadn't noticed before. Among his things, he found a small leather bag containing dried herbs that gave off an aroma that reminded him of full moon nights and ancient forests. The goat Sarah had brought as a dowry was restless in the pen, pacing back and forth and looking constantly toward the forest. The animal seemed to sense something that Thomas couldn't perceive, a connection to events that were beyond his comprehension. All day, the goat refused food and water, keeping alert as if waiting for some signal that only she could detect. The days following Sarah's disappearance passed like a dense, suffocating fog. Thomas woke up every morning expecting to find her making coffee in the kitchen, in that quiet, efficient way he had grown to admire. But the house remained empty, filled only with the echo of his own footsteps and the weight of questions he could not answer. He had lost wives before, but never in this way. Death was something a man could understand, accept, and eventually overcome. The disappearance was different. It was a wound that couldn't heal because I didn't know whether to accept the loss or keep waiting. The goat Sarah had brought kept refusing food. Thomas tried everything, offering the best hay he could buy in town, fresh water from the neighbor's well, even fruit that cost more than he could afford. The animal just looked at him with those smart yellow eyes and then directed his gaze to the forest. It was as if she were waiting for instructions that only she could hear. Thomas began to suspect that the goat knew something about Sarah that he didn't, some secret that connected the two of them in a way that went beyond simple possession. On the fourth day, Thomas decided to search the city for answers. He visited Reverend Morrison first, hoping to find some consolation or at least a rational explanation for what had happened. The Reverend received him with the usual kindness, but Thomas noticed a discomfort in his eyes when he mentioned Sarah. The man chose his words carefully, talking about the mysteries of faith and the need to accept divine plans, but avoided looking directly at Thomas when he described the night of the disappearance. It was then that the Reverend mentioned the rumors, whispered words among the older women in the congregation, stories about a woman who had appeared in other cities in the territory years ago. Always the same description: small, dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. Always looking for lonely men, always offering marriage in exchange for shelter, and always disappearing before anyone could truly know her. Thomas left the church with more questions than answers. He visited the tavern, where the older men drank and told stories that mixed truth with fantasy. There he heard even stranger reports. An old cattle trader swore he had seen a woman running naked through the woods on a full moon night 5 years ago. His words were tainted by alcohol, but there was a sincerity in his eyes that made Thomas pay attention. The man described a figure that ran with impossible speed, leaping over obstacles as if it had wings, disappearing among the trees like smoke. Another man, an experienced hunter named Jake Patterson, told of strange footprints he had found near his property, marks that started out human and gradually morphed into something different, something he couldn't identify despite decades of tracking wildlife. Jake talked about nights when he heard calls coming from the woods, sounds that made his horses restless and his dogs hide under the porch. Thomas returned home with his mind buzzing with possibilities that defied everything he believed in. He spent the night examining the belongings Sarah had left behind, looking for clues that could explain her true identity. The clothes were ordinary, without distinguishing marks. The mirror was scratched and old, but the bag of herbs kept giving off that wild aroma that reminded him of the night she disappeared. When he opened the bag, he found more than just dried herbs. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of soft fabric, was a small silver medallion. The metal was tainted by age, but it was still possible to make out a symbol etched into the surface. It was a crescent moon intertwined with tree branches, a design that looked familiar, but that he couldn't place in his memory. On the back of the medallion was an inscription in a language he did not recognize, letters that seemed to dance under the lamplight. That night, Thomas dreamed of Sarah for the first time since her disappearance. In the dream, she was standing at the edge of the forest wearing the same dark dress as the night she left, but there was something different about her. Her skin glowed with a silver light, and her eyes reflected the moon in a way that was both beautiful and frightening. She held out her hand to him, as if inviting him to follow her, but when he tried to get closer, she moved away, always keeping the same distance. In the dream, Thomas could hear his voice for the first time. She spoke in whispers, words he understood without knowing how. She apologized for leaving, explained that she had no choice, that there were forces at work that were greater than both. It was about an ancient curse, about a cursed family wandering between two worlds, never completely belonging to either of them. He talked about nights of transformation, about the need to return to the forest when the moon was full, about the impossibility of living a completely human life. Thomas woke up with tears in his eyes and the taste of loss in his mouth. The dream had been more real than any experience she had ever had. He could still smell Sarah's perfume in the air. He could still hear the echo of her voice in his ears. For the first time since she left, he didn't just feel confused or abandoned. He felt something he didn't expect, understanding. And more than that, she felt the beginning of something that could be true love, born not of convenience or necessity, but of the recognition of a wounded soul that mirrored her own. Thomas spent the next week preparing for something he couldn't name. Sarah's locket sat on the kitchen table, catching the morning light and reflecting it off in patterns that seemed to change as he watched it. There was something hypnotic about that object, an energy that attracted him and at the same time unsettled him. He had begun to carry it in his pocket, feeling its weight against his chest as a constant reminder that his wife was not just an ordinary woman who had run away out of regret. The goat had finally started eating again, but his behavior was still strange. She followed Thomas around the property, always keeping a respectful distance, but never losing sight of him. When he worked repairing the fences or taking care of the other animals, she positioned herself in such a way as to have a clear view of both him and the forest. It was as if she was keeping some kind of vigil, protecting him from something he couldn't see. Thomas had begun to notice other signs that he was not alone on the property. Small, delicate footprints appeared in the dirt around the house during the night, always disappearing before he could follow them to their origin. Food disappeared from the pantry, not in large quantities but enough for him to notice. An apple here, a piece of bread there, as if someone were eating carefully so as not to be detected. The moon was rising again, approaching the full shape it had witnessed the night Sarah disappeared. Thomas felt a growing anxiety as the nights passed, a sense that something important was approaching. He had begun to spend his nights on the porch, watching the forest, waiting for some sign that it was still around. It was on the 12th night after her disappearance that Thomas finally saw her again. It was almost midnight when a figure emerged from the edge of the forest, moving with the same fluid grace that he remembered. Sarah was different, thinner, with her skin even more sunburned. Their clothes were the same as the day they met, but now they were torn and stained with dirt. She approached the house slowly, stopping every few steps to look around, as if checking if it was safe to continue. Thomas came down from the balcony slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might send her running away again. When he got close enough to see his eyes, he realized that there was something different about them. The distance she had always maintained had diminished, replaced by a vulnerability she had never shown before. Sarah seemed more human than at any point during their 3 days of marriage, but also more fragile, as if she were fighting forces that were tearing her apart from within. She spoke for the first time since she had left, her voice hoarse from days of silence. He apologized, not for the words he chose, but for the pain he could hear behind them. He explained that he had not been able to stay away, that something was pulling her back to him with a force that he could not resist. He talked about nights spent watching the house from a distance, fighting the urge to return and the fear that her presence would bring danger to him. Thomas held out his hand to her, and this time Sarah didn't move away. When his fingers touched, he felt the same heat wave he had experienced on the night of his wedding, but now there was something more. A connection that went beyond the physical, a mutual understanding of two people who had found something rare and precious in the vast wilderness of their lonely lives. Sarah told her story in fragments, as if each word cost enormous effort. It told of a family cursed generations ago by a wise woman who had been betrayed by white men. The curse condemned the women of her lineage to live divided between two worlds, never being able to stay long in the human world without their true nature claiming control. She had spent years wandering from town to town, looking for someone who could accept her true nature and break the cycle of loneliness that consumed her. As Sarah spoke, Thomas began to understand that what he had felt for her during their brief days together had only been the beginning of something much bigger. True love, he realized, was not born of beauty or convenience, but of the recognition of a soul that complemented his own. Sarah was not just a woman who had married him out of necessity. It was someone who had chosen to trust him with his deepest secrets, someone who had returned despite the risks because he had found in him something worth fighting for. She explained that the transformation happened during full moon nights, when her wild nature became stronger than her human will. During these times, she needed to return to the forest to avoid hurting those she cared about. But the curse was more complex than simple transformation. It also prevented her from forming lasting bonds, forcing her to leave behind any life she managed to build before it became too real. Thomas listened to it all in silence, absorbing every word, every pause, every moment of hesitation in his voice. When she finished, he took the locket out of his pocket and offered it to her. Sarah looked at the object with surprise, and then at it with something that could be hope. She explained that the locket had belonged to the first woman in her family to be cursed, and that it had been passed down from mother to daughter as a reminder of her dark heritage. But when Thomas held her hand and placed the locket in her palm, something changed. The silver warmed under their touch, and for a moment, the engraved symbol shone with a soft light. Sarah looked at him in awe and fear, as if she was seeing for the first time the possibility that her curse might have a solution. Thomas didn't fully understand what was going on, but he knew he had reached a point in his life where the love he felt for her was stronger than any fear of the unknown. The full moon came 3 nights after Sarah's return, bringing with it the anxiety they both felt but dared not mention. Thomas had spent his days watching his wife with renewed attention, noticing small details that had previously eluded his notice. The way she played the medallion constantly, as if it were a talisman against unseen forces. How his eyes turned to the forest whenever a cloud covered the sun. How his hands trembled slightly as he spoke about the approaching night. Sarah had tried to explain to Thomas what would happen when the transformation began, but the words seemed inadequate to describe something so ancient and primitive. She talked about the pain that accompanied the change, not only physical, but emotional. The temporary loss of his humanity, the complete submersion in the wild nature that inhabited his blood. During those hours, she would no longer be the woman he had learned to love, but something completely different, something that could be dangerous for him if he didn't keep his distance. Thomas listened to their concerns, but his resolve only strengthened. He had lost Sarah once because he didn't understand her true nature. I wouldn't make the same mistake again. If the love he felt for her was real, and he believed it was, then he needed to be there during his moment of greatest vulnerability. Not as a frightened bystander, but as a companion who accepted all parts of who she was, including those she herself feared. When night came, Sarah tried to move away from the house, heading for the woods as she had done weeks ago. But this time, Thomas followed her, ignoring her protests and pleas for her to remain safe. He carried with him a lamp and a determination that had grown stronger during the days of separation. He had learned that true love was not something that was practiced at a distance, but something that required presence, even in the most difficult moments. The transformation began when they reached the heart of the forest, in a clearing where the light of the full moon bathed the ground in liquid silver. Sarah doubled over in pain, her body convulsing as ancient forces claimed control. Thomas watched heartbroken as she fought the change, seeing the agony in her eyes as her humanity was temporarily swept away by more primal instincts. But he didn't walk away, no matter how frightening the transformation became. When the change was complete, the creature Sarah had become looked at him with eyes that shone like embers in the darkness. For a moment, Thomas saw only pure savagery, a non-human intelligence that assessed him as possible prey or threat. But then he did something that no other man had done before. Instead of running away or trying to defend himself, he reached out, offering the locket he had been warming in his palm all night. The creature hesitated, its head tilting as it studied the object that shone with its own light. Slowly, cautiously, she approached. When their claws touched the heated silver, something extraordinary happened. The light of the locket intensified, enveloping both of them in a silvery aura that pulsed like a heart. Thomas felt a surge of energy run through his body, connecting him not only with Sarah, but with all the generations of women in his family who had carried that curse. In that moment of total connection, Thomas understood that the curse was not broken by love alone, but by complete acceptance. All the other women in her lineage had been rejected by the men who claimed to love them when their true nature was revealed. But Thomas was there, fearlessly, offering not only his love, but his understanding and acceptance of all that she was. The light from the medallion exploded into a cascade of silver energy that illuminated the entire forest. When the luminosity subsided, Sarah was back in her human form, but there was something different about her. The constant tension he had always carried was gone, replaced by a peace Thomas had never seen in his eyes. The locket in his hands had lost its otherworldly luster, becoming just a beautiful piece of ancient silver, its purpose finally fulfilled. Sarah looked at Thomas with tears in her eyes, not of pain or fear, but of deep gratitude and love. She explained that for the first time in her life, she felt complete, not torn between two worlds, but fully human and free to choose her own destiny. The curse had been broken not by magic, but by the transformative power of unconditional love. They returned home hand in hand, where the goat waited patiently in the corral. The animal, which had served as a silent witness to the entire journey, finally seemed at peace, its vigil over. Thomas realized that the goat had never been just a trading animal, but a guardian sent to protect Sarah until she found someone capable of loving her completely. In the years that followed, Thomas's farm flourished in a way he had never imagined possible. Sarah brought with her not only her practical skills, but a deep understanding of the land that came from her ancestral connection to nature. Together, they built not only a thriving estate, but a home filled with genuine love, born not of convenience or necessity, but of the mutual acceptance and recognition of two souls who had found their completeness in each other. Thomas often looked at his wife working in the garden or tending the animals, still in awe of the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. He had started out looking for just one solution to his financial problems, but he had found something infinitely more valuable. I had learned that true love was not about finding someone perfect, but about completely accepting someone imperfect and discovering that this acceptance transformed both the lover and the beloved. If this story has touched your heart, and you want to follow more exciting narratives from the Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Tap the notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming adventures we've prepared, especially for you. Your entry motivates us to continue bringing stories that celebrate the transformative power of true love and unconditional acceptance.